I'm on a mission to beat 100 video games every year, and this is each of the 10 games I finished in June ranked by how happy it made me. So let's kick it off with number 10, Ninja Gaiden for the Master System. I'm 4 games into this series now, and I've never liked it. Every game is broken beyond repair and insanely difficult in the least fair way, but this one turned out to be almost my favorite. Just like the original trilogy, the Master System reboot just cannot get anything right when it comes to hitboxes, platforming, input delay, level design, and the list goes on. Not only that, I actually thought this later game had less interesting pixel art and music, which is usually the only real bright spot this franchise has to offer. But they do tweak the formula in a couple of ways to make some aspects a bit more palatable, like an increased health bar and more health pickups during the levels. The highlight, without question, is that instead of the usual blindingly difficult boss battles, this entry's bosses have much more intuitive and interesting attack patterns, which make them slightly more reasonable. On top of that, when you die to one of these bosses, an overhauled checkpoint system will drop you right back into the fight rather than forcing you to play through half the level again. This game still isn't good, and I like the original Ninja Gaiden more because it's the least broken, but the Master System reboot had enough high points to make it my second favorite so far. Up next at number 9 is #Blood. I had high hopes for this Saturday morning cartoon-esque action RPG, and the concept is there, but the execution is unfortunately pretty terrible. Let's hit the high notes first. The animation style perfectly captures the look of late 90s to early 2000s cartoons like Dexter's Labs and the Powerpuff Girls, which I don't think I've seen in popular gaming yet. The writing is clever and frequently hilarious, and the ideas for some of the boss fights at the end of these Zelda-like dungeons are totally bonkers in just the right ways. But almost none of those great ideas for boss fights are actually any fun because the moment-to-moment combat is atrocious. Almost everything that could go wrong here does. You can't even get near danger without suddenly taking damage, your weapon goes right through things constantly, and the dodge roll will often get you stuck inside enemies until you just die. The UI feels like it was designed to be confusing. I had to quit out and lose progress about 10 times because of freezing, and about a third of the game when it is working is just fetch quests. I really wanted to like this, but every time I would start to have fun and think, maybe this isn't so bad, something else would break and I'd be right back to yelling at my screen. Above that at number 8 is Kirby's Dream Land 2. This is the 4th Kirby game I've been able to beat in order, and it's not my favorite so far, but it's pretty close. It's a clear improvement over the original Dream Land, where you couldn't even take on enemies' powers. Not only has that feature been added, but there are also different permutations of each power depending on which animal friend you happen to be riding, so the combinations are near endless. The original Dream Land was a bit too easy. It was very short, the enemy variety was bare bones, and you could simply fly right over some of the levels from start to finish. This second installment is much longer, the enemy variety is all over the place, the levels are designed to keep you from cheesing them, and some of the boss fights are legitimately tough. Although it's still an original Game Boy title, it really plays more like a sequel to Kirby's Adventure since it incorporates so much that came with that SNES release. It's not my favorite Kirby game because I really liked Dream Course, but it is my favorite 2D platformer from Kirby so far. I'm not crazy about these older 2D platformers, but within the genre, I would say I like this better than Sonic, but not as much as Mario. Coming in at number 7 is Still Wakes the Deep. Does the idea of being stranded on a malfunctioning oil rig in the middle of the ocean sound terrifying to you? Spoiler alert, it definitely is. Make no mistake, this is a horror game through and through, so much so that there's little else even going on. No combat, no inventory, no RPG elements, not even any puzzles. And while that might sound like a walking sim, it really isn't. There's plenty of skill-based content here like stealth, QTEs, and tricky ledge traversal to challenge your will to survive. I don't want to spoil the big baddie here in case you haven't seen the trailers, but it is horrifying, and the top tier voice acting performances do an amazing job of conveying real fear and all-out panic. There were a couple issues, although they were minor. I got stuck in the environment a couple of times, and the mostly very helpful waypoints would occasionally fail to update once I reached them, which led to some confusion. I also found the swimming controls to be pretty clunky, which is a shame because you spend a fair amount of time in the water. To be honest, this straightforward experience would have needed a lot more video gaming material for it to rank really high anyway, but if you like short linear horror games, you could do a lot worse. Moving on to number 6, it's Halo 3 ODST. This kind of retro first-person shooter isn't among my very favorite genres, but within that arena, it seems Halo is basically the gold standard, and ODST is no exception. A lot of FPS titles from this period are floaty, imprecise, ugly shades of brown and gray, and the jerky movement and aiming tends to make me motion sick. But not Halo. The world is beautiful and vibrant, movement on foot and in vehicles is fluid, and the shooting is impressively realistic for the time, especially considering the vast array of crazy weaponry. ODST goes even further by making some specific specific improvements to the formula, like a much better waypoint system that kept me from getting lost like I did in the labyrinthine levels of the earlier games. I also appreciated the remixed mission formula, which would move you around different areas depending on which character you were playing as. This lent itself well to perhaps the most unique story I've experienced in a Halo game yet. The more tightly focused narrative on a group of normal soldiers was an interesting, more intimate departure from the usual, more epic Master Chief plotline. Even though it was really short and it lacked some of the wow factor of the other entries, I still enjoyed it more than Halo 1 or 3, but not quite as much as Halo 2. Now we're in the top 5 with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I've now beaten all 3 of the Tomb Raider reboot games, and I have to say, while all of them are great, this is easily the least impressive of the trilogy. None of it is outright bad, and a lot of it is excellent, especially when it comes to the production value. The graphics, writing, voice acting, and sound design are all top tier. The combat is better than ever, and with stealth, gunplay, melee, arrows, and more at your disposal, it's exhilarating to know there are tons of ways to approach every conflict scenario. But while the moment-to-moment execution rarely misses, there are some overarching flaws with the premise that drag this latest installment down, particularly when it comes to the story. The initial reboot was amazing, and Rise of the Tomb Raider did what sequels are supposed to. It raised the stakes to 11 and made everything from the set pieces to the villains bigger and better. This latest entry dials everything way back down. The locations are one note, the new characters are drab, and while there are 1 or 2 crazier moments, even these seem somewhat routine and overplayed. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is still a must-play if you want to see Lara Croft's latest journey through to the end, but don't expect to be wowed like you probably were the first couple times. Next up is Slay the Spire at number 4. This is the first straightforward card battling roguelike I've ever finished, but as a fan of both roguelikes and card battlers, I felt right at home here. The combat system is intricate enough to be deeply engrossing, but not so complex that it's overwhelming or obtuse. I had an awesome time fighting my way up through the levels, and the difficulty was such that I always felt like I was about to die, even though in reality it only took me 3 runs to get to the credits. I was a bit confused by all the relics. Later in the game they gave me so many that every time I attacked 9 different things would trigger, and that felt a little more luck-based than I would have liked. My only other gripe is more of a preference issue with roguelikes in general. This genre just doesn't know how to have a single clear ending. I know there's a ton of content after you beat this the first time, but I stop playing when the credits roll unless it's clearly a joke, and I literally got an achievement that said beat the game. I've had a billion fights about whether I've really beaten games like this, but the only alternative is to play through it multiple times, and I'm sorry, but I just don't have the time or the interest. I got credits, I loved it, it's over. In third place, we've got Life is Strange. This game was a journey. I went from thinking it was okay to not liking it, then to liking it a lot, and finally to thinking it was absolutely incredible. It starts with a clever premise. Rewinding time is a unique way to mix up the choose-your-own-adventure formula that makes it decidedly more video gamey. But the mechanic itself was a bit clunky and way too slow, and I found some of the earlier writing to be ham-fisted and unable to fully capture how a power like this would actually look and feel. I also couldn't get over how unbelievably stupid everyone is. I was literally yelling at my TV like I was watching one of those B-horror films where nobody's capable of making any smart decisions. But I came to realize that like those horror films, a bunch of bumbling characters can actually heighten the experience, and also they're literal children, so of course they're gonna make some dumb choices. It starts out slow, but things eventually do get a lot more interesting, and then it doesn't let up until a finale that stuck the landing more beautifully than almost any game I've ever played. If you're a fan of branching narratives and you like the idea of a game that allows you to tweak your decisions over and over, Life is Strange definitely belongs on your shortlist. Just missing the number 1 spot is Titan Quest at number 2. I didn't know what kind of game this was until I booted it up, so as a huge fan of the Diablo series, when I realized what I was playing, my eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. This is one of my very favorite genres, and while it's clearly heavily inspired by Diablo 2, I actually think I like this slightly more. Is that crazy? I found the loot progression to be a bit more interesting, and the skill tree that allows you to specialize in multiple classes was very well put together and simply more fun to me than that of its predecessor. I don't pay a ton of attention to the stories in this genre, but I will say that the huge environment changes from act to act were a welcome surprise that I didn't see coming. There were some issues, but I think most of them stemmed from what seemed to be a pretty rough port to consoles. It's clear this wasn't originally designed with a controller in mind because the UI was really cumbersome and there was some serious input delay when using skills that made many of them near worthless. But the good easily outweighed the bad, and if you're a fan of retro dungeon crawlers like Diablo 2, this is absolutely a must-play, and now I can't wait for the upcoming sequel. And finally, my number 1 favorite game I beat in June is Return of the Obra Dinn. If you haven't played this, it's hard to even describe what genre it is. I guess it's a mystery puzzle exploration game, but whatever kind of game it is, it's one of the best I've ever played. The other game it reminds me of the most is probably Outer Wilds, which I have at number 6 all time, by the way, because it's all about gradually gathering evidence until the ultimate solution is within reach. More than anything though, it actually reminded me of Sudoku, because the core gameplay loop is all about filling in the most obvious information first and leaving the harder stuff until the end when you have enough context from the other answers to help you out. And while that might sound boring, the gradual drip feeding of the story that you get by putting these clues together little by little is intensely satisfying. I do have one minor complaint. I didn't like how the game rushed me along by forcing me into the next memory before I even got a chance to understand the current one. I felt like it was causing me to miss more crucial details than I would have otherwise. But these little hiccups are going to happen when you're building something that's never been done before, and Obra Dinn should be played by absolutely everyone who enjoys a good mystery. So that's it for the month of June, and it brings us to a total of 62 games beaten so far in 2024, and a grand total of 509 games since we started doing this all the way back at the beginning of 2020. Remember to click like if you enjoyed the video, and next month we'll be playing GTA 4, Tales of Iron, Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn, and much, much more. So feel free to subscribe if you want to see what takes the #1 spot in July.